Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. So it's really hard to overstate the importance of one particular election happening right now in New York City, which is the race for Manhattan's district attorney. Manhattan's current DA, Cy Vance, is not running for re-election, which leaves 8 candidates vying to become one of America's most powerful prosecutors. Now, for people who practice law in New York, Manhattan is known as one of New York's less forgiving boroughs. And I shouldn't just say for people who practice, for people who experience the law in New York, Manhattan is known as one of New York's harsher boroughs when it comes to the criminal legal system. They prosecute at present pretty much every case that the NYPD brings them. That's according to analysis by the Vera Institute of Justice. Black New Yorkers are 20% more likely to be detained pre-trial when prosecuted by the Manhattan DA's office. But all of that could change this year. The candidates vying for the seat seem to have sensed a public demand for change. And all 8, for the most part, have presented themselves as smart on crime or progressive. But there are key differences in the policy promises that they have made and are making that make it clear that they're not all cut from the same cloth. And they actually range broadly across the political and carceral spectrum. So today, we're doing our second interview. We're very pleased to speak with Tahanie Aboushi, a civil rights litigator. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
So let's start with a really, really easy, simple, totally no big deal question. What will be the difference between your administration and the administration of Cy Vance?
Well, for me, the fight for criminal justice reform has always gone beyond Cy Vance and really is a criticism of the entire system. And one of the things that have always been missing is the voices of the impacted community, community leaders, those who have been in the trenches of fighting systemic racism and trying to balance the scales of justice. And that lived experience and that perspective is what's important to accomplish a decarceral system, to ensure that we are protecting people's rights, that we are addressing the systemic racism, promoting restorative justice. And for me, as somebody that grew up a byproduct of the system, when I was a kid, my father was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Overnight, my mom became a single parent to 10 children. And that was my introduction to the prosecution system. That was the first time I ever stepped into a courtroom. And it's what inspired me to become an attorney, to stand by families like mine and to pursue accountability and justice in a really meaningful way.
So I want to get specific about what this means, because I hear you on the sort of systemic, the system is bigger than Cy Vance, but I know that voters want to know very, very specifically, like, what will you do? What does that mean for you? What does that look like in practice? And the thing that stands out to me the most that I think we need to talk about right off the bat is this list of 40 offenses that you put out that you say you would not prosecute.
Right.
Now, full disclosure, I'm a former public defender. So when I look at that list, I see a lot of things that took up like 90% of my time as a defense lawyer. 90% of my time trying to help people stop their lives from falling apart over very low level, racially biased arrests. So how, when you talk about not prosecuting cases going forward, I can't help but think about all my clients who have already experienced that harm, who are already prosecuted for like walking down the street with a screwdriver in their pocket, or for resisting arrest because their face resisted a cop's fist. What will your changes do for people who've already been prosecuted? How can you make these changes look backward as well as people going forward?
No, I think you make a great point, right? Is what are the reasons that these charges are being used? And we know that they are abusive and they cover bad policing and they don't impact public safety. And so when we talk about dismantling systemic racism, this list goes exactly to the heart of that issue. And what we can do to those who have unfortunately already experienced these types of charges and have been impacted by it, we bring them back into the office and part of that advisory council to understand how we can make sure we're deterring this behavior, to ensure that they're part of conversations at the decision-making table to understand how we're going to do things different, and to also focus on the path forward, right? Not only just rehabilitation and preventing recidivism, but holding law enforcement accountable and making that data publicly available, to make sure we're using this office as a bully pulpit to change these abusive policies and practices.
So I have two questions that kind of arise from that. One, I just want to clarify something you said. You said you would bring these people back into the office. Do you mean that you would actually like invite my former clients to come to your office and sit down with you about what policies you're going to be using going forward?
So when we talk about making sure that this office is representative, right, it means hiring staff that are reflective of those that are impacted by this office, right? Not just making sure we have diverse people based on their religion, their race, or their gender, but to ensure that the experiences are present as well. And then I'm also going to establish an advisory council, one of made up of people from across the spectrum, from public health professionals to formerly incarcerated to victims and accused alike, defense attorneys, civil rights lawyers, so that we are addressing this not only from a public health perspective, but also from a holistic perspective to ensure that we are responding to what is happening and that our office is also held accountable.
So, assuming someone, let's say someone has lived experience that goes to what you're speaking about. Someone was prosecuted by the Manhattan DA's office. They were incarcerated for a period of time. They were released. They've done great things with their life. They've received whatever credential they would need to make them eligible to work at the DA's office. Are you saying you're open to hiring people who have been formerly incarcerated if they are otherwise appropriate for jobs in your office?
Absolutely.
So turning now to why people are in prison in New York. Half of new prison admissions right now are due to technical violations of parole. In other words, people who are doing time, coming home, getting put on parole, and then going back to prison because they missed curfew or failed to update an address or something that's not a crime. Something that's not a crime for anybody not on parole. It's only a crime if you're on parole. Right. Now, during the pandemic, there were groups speaking up for elders in prison, the Release Aging People in Prison project, pointing out that these prisons are now holding thousands of aging, vulnerable people who could safely be released through compassionate release or clemency, and who are now at risk of death from this pandemic. So we're looking at this state with tens of thousands of people sitting in prison who do not need to be there. And I know you are only running for Manhattan DA, but I want to know how you could use that position to try and lower prison populations statewide.
Yeah, I think two things, right? One, this office should be proactive in reviewing sentences, right? And one of the things that I've committed to doing is establishing a sentencing review unit that would take into consideration not just wrongful convictions, but convictions in excess of 20 years, those who are immunocompromised, and those who are facing the very real reality of contracting COVID or other diseases, especially since we know that those who are incarcerated age faster and their health deteriorates faster because of those conditions. So I think we can be proactive in doing sentencing review and supporting defense motions for early release and really assessing the conditions of people who are detained and ensuring that we're not sentencing them to death. I'm against the death penalty. Reduce all of that to data and make it available to the public. And then again, use this office as a bully pulpit to change these abusive policies and practices, but then also hold them accountable. Call it for what it is, instead of covering for bad policing. And this is something I've always stood by and I'll continue to do as a district attorney of Manhattan. Although we might work with the NYPD, we don't work for the NYPD. And we have our own resources and our own discretion and our own power to yield and use in furtherance of protecting the public and supporting justice.
So you know what? You're doing great. We got to pause. It's not your fault. It's not my fault. We are apparently not live right now. We got to pause because we've gone off live.
Okay.
But we will start again.
We're
going to start again in time because I have so many really good questions. I got to remember what I was going to, hold on. I'm going to type down what I want to say from where you left off.
Okay. It's showing live on my end, by the way.
We're back up. Okay. We're back up still. So you were just talking about your office, the Manhattan DA's office, when you are DA, will not work for the NYPD, but with the NYPD. But I want to be realistic about the NYPD's grasp on power, right? Because it's not, they don't seem like the kind of people who are just like, you know what, you're right, we're cool, we're going to step aside, you do you, prosecute us if you need to. They seem like the people who drive a car into a crowd of protesters. So when you talk about, let's take, for example, your list of 40 offenses that you will not prosecute. I remember a situation that happened with Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore, where her office decided they were not going to prosecute marijuana cases anymore. But the police pushed back and said, you know what, we're still going to make the arrests. We're going to make the arrests. We're going to put people in handcuffs. We're going to take them out of wherever they are. We're going to drag them to the station. We're going to book them. You know, that process itself is very damaging, very intrusive. People can lose their job if they miss a shift because they are undergoing a police process. And of course, any contact with police at all for Black and brown Americans could be lethal. So at what stage will that not prosecuting happen? Can you stop police from making arrests on that? Will that happen when the police bring you their arrest paperwork? Like, at what stage is your office going to say no? And how will you minimize harm in doing that?
So two ways. One, in the arrest review unit that we're going to establish, that is where we'll scrutinize that interaction. The more we will make our decision to decline to prosecute, especially cases on our decline to prosecute list. The second thing is to be able to use this office as a bully pulpit to change the laws on the books that permit officers to make these arrests. And to ensure that we're fully decriminalizing things like marijuana, as opposed to this half legalization, half criminalization model that we have now. And then also, calling it out for what it is. I think that the district attorney's office is a powerful bully pulpit that is barely, if at all, used. And so these will be opportunities to go against the grain and to hear what people are saying, what our advocates are saying, and pushing back on the rhetoric, which is often dominated by the law enforcement community and language.
So thinking about that legislative support, that it sounds like you are very ready to use this position as a very public platform, but that you want to make change in the law as well as making change in office policy. Last month, in an article, an interview you gave to The Appeal, you said you would leave the state DAs Association. Now, that's the primary organization that lobbies on behalf of DAs. Of course, what they lobby for is regressive, and they lobbied against bail reform, and they lobbied against discovery reform. So is it still your position that you would leave them? And if you would, how would you concretely push back against that influence that they have with legislators in Albany?
I would absolutely leave the association. I think, it's when we're talking about doing something different for Manhattan, needing transformational change, you can't do it using the same tools, relying on the same old experience that got us here. Right. And I am concerned with how this office has the association is just the default position of opposing a lot of reforms. And so, I'm very much going to take this office public, and I'm very much will make sure that we are fighting alongside advocates to change things. And we can establish our own association, the likes of what California has done. An alternative alliance where we are open to discussion, really collaborating with the public, having a comprehensive review and response to the positions that need our attention.
So thinking then about that, let's take the bail reform fight, for example. That was one where, New York underwent this historic bail reform, and then those gains were rolled back by state leadership. And as you and I both know, every time someone is sent to Rikers Island or New York's very unique and very horrifying jail boat, their lives are torn apart and they risk losing everything. Now, in terms of bail reform in New York, against which the DAs Association fought, against which many DAs in the state fought, do you think it went far enough? And what would you do concretely in your office to change the way line DAs in arraignment courtrooms actually prosecute cases?
As a civil rights attorney and someone that is also focused on our constitutional rights, we have to understand that the presumption of innocence is just extremely important. And it just has been eroded by the automation of our justice system, bail being one of them. To base somebody's freedom or ability to keep their home afloat and keep their jobs on whether or not they can pay is what got us here, right? And so we have to remove that. And so I'm committed to ending cash bail. And I think it could go further. I think discovery is, again, just a basic right to have information and be able to fairly explore and fight a case, and for the defense to have access for that information. And so we've also committed to open file discovery and ensuring that we are getting information and turning it over to the defense just as fast. And then to your last part of your question, which I think might be slipping away from me. What was your question, Emily, the last part?
And actually, this links into my next question. So I'm going to fold it into my next question, which is that in a lot of offices where DAs have been elected on a platform of change, and they've tried to implement bold ideas, they face rebellion from the line attorneys in the office. And to the actual people appearing in court, it's those line attorneys that matter, because those are the prosecutors who are actually in the courtrooms. When you're in an office as big as Manhattan, there are tens of thousands of cases happening at any given time. You can't have eyes on all of them. The people with eyes on them are these line attorneys in the office. So, for example, in an arraignment courtroom, it's the line attorney who decides whether or not to ask for cash bail. And in other contexts, in offering pleas, in charging, in making decisions that can stack so many charges on a person, they feel like they have to plead guilty because they're so scared of what will happen if they don't. What policies will you implement in your office to make sure that the DAs who actually appear in court are not undermining the vision of a Manhattan office that creates freedom and safety for everyone, regardless of race and privilege?
Yeah, and I think those are great points, right? As we can say all the right things, but if our line ADAs and our office staff are not furthering those initiatives, then it's problematic, right? It's probably even sabotage at that point. I think it's important to have access and an open line of communication with the defense bar, right? Public defenders, criminal defense attorneys, and private practice who are going to have a line of communication to say, hey, heads up, you promised these things, but this is what's actually happening in the courtroom. And then to meet regularly and make sure that we are addressing when we go off course and then correct course. And I think we'll have to obviously come in and do a lot of cleaning house, right? Although Vance has been there for 10 years, the district attorney before him was there for over 30 years. And there has been just a culture of convicting at all costs and automation that has just made certain practices okay, and they're not okay. So we will have to retrain line ADAs who are willing to change their ways, but also keep an eye on them. And also there are organizations like Court Watch that will sit in a courtroom and ensure that our policies are properly implemented and that there's a real commitment to the promises that we've made. And we'll rely on those partners as well to be checks and balances on us so we can correct course.
So going back for a second to this idea of accountability and changing what actually happens in the courtrooms. You mentioned, of course, earlier as a civil rights litigator, like you understand the value of an independent unit to prosecute police and to hold police accountable. Right. But what about when it comes to police perjury? We often talk in our industry about test-a-lying and cops getting on the stand and saying whatever will most likely convict someone. Will you utilize a do not call list or other tactics to not rely on officers who've been known to lie in the past?
Absolutely. And, one of the reasons why police accountability is so important, and I know you know this, Emily, right, is that when you dissect that relationship, that interaction, on one side, you have a police officer that's protected by the state, that is indemnified, even when found to have been engaged in wrongdoing, that has a lot of protections administratively and otherwise, and their jobs are almost always safe. And this is somebody that can possess a weapon, discharge that weapon, restrict your freedom. And on the other side of that is you, the civilian, and whatever you have in your pocket. And so, yes, that do not call list is important, and we'll make sure we use it. But we're going to go even further. All of the information that we collect and we synthesize at that moment when the officer brings that arrest paperwork to our office will be made public. And we're going to track those patterns and practices. What are the backgrounds of these officers? What about the backgrounds of those that they are stopping and restricting at this point? What are the charges? What are the allegations? What are the sources of this information? And I think that's going to be an important part in understanding how people come into contact with police officers. What are those patterns in practice? And then the independence of the DA's office to actually sift through it and hold them accountable in that way as well.
So, speaking of accountability, we spoke this morning with another candidate in the race who talked about, Ms. Farhadian Weinstein talked about sex work through a lens of victimhood. She referenced sex workers as survivors. She said she thinks of sex workers as survivors. But I know that a lot of folks who are engaged in that line of work would push back on this idea that there's some aspect of saving involved in sex work policy. So you've talked generally about how you would decriminalize sex work as DA, but you've left the door open in what I've read to prosecuting sex work in school zones. Now, I know it sounds awful, I know, but having practiced in New York, I also know that school zones are really, really big, and a lot of the geography of the city is a school zone. A huge chunk of New York falls in that. So that could still be a huge volume of prosecuting sex work. And I want to know, what your position is on this. Is your position consistent with ending the harm associated with the criminalization of sex work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are 100% for decriminalizing sex work, not the Nordic model, full decriminalization, dismantling the NYPD Vice Unit that has just really been allowed to perpetuate some of the most abusive practices on the sex workers. When it comes time to the school zone, the 230.03 provision, we worked in co-governance with sex work organizations and advocates in response to the legislative bill that's now on the table. And to talk about how we're going to address each of these measures legislatively. Now, on our side, the precautions we took is that, well, let's find out where these school zones are. Can we change those restrictions? And even in that respect, remove the criminal penalties. So even in my position there, we haven't committed to automatically prosecuting these cases, but to keep an eye on what these school zones actually are, and then work, again, using our office as a bully pulpit to change that legislation while also keeping an eye on not decriminalizing sex work.
All right, so I just want to make sure I understand. So you want to work on legislation to decriminalize while reserving discretion to prosecute or not prosecute based on the individual circumstances of the case? Is that, or is this a blanket not prosecuting sex work? I just want to make sure that our viewers are clear.
Yeah, it's a blanket not prosecuting sex work. The concern with the legislation is that that school zone provision, that charge is not in the bill. And so it's left on us, the DA's office, to reconcile that gap between what the legislators are working on, what activists are working on. And for us, it just comes down to exactly where the perimeters are for the school zone. But my personal position is, yeah, we have to decriminalize it, right? We're not going to move forward with prosecuting these cases, but the proximity is what's being held up on the legislator level.
Got it. So that's a legislation conversation in your office. Your personal position is you would not prosecute even in these zones.
Right.
Got it. Okay. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Ms. Aboushi, this has been wonderful. It's been very clarifying for me. I hope it's been clarifying for our viewers. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you so much for having me. Always appreciate the detailed questions, Emily.
No problem.
Great job.
There you have it, candidate number 2, Tahanie Aboushi. For those of you watching in Manhattan, I hope you're watching closely. There's so much detail and so much at play in this race. This is going to be one of the most important races. Haven't we had enough time since we had an important election to be worried about? There was an important election. It was like last year. We can be stressed about an election again. So I hope you all are watching really closely, paying attention. We're going to be doing a whole series of interviews that you can catch here. If you follow The Appeal on Twitter, on Facebook, wherever you would like to stream us, we will do these interviews and get the answers you need. I'm Emily Galvan-Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.